Hi everyone, I'm Nikki Regenball and I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I'm here to talk to you about my project, Dine or Dash, Temperature and Cannibalism Drive Size Bias Dispersal. So I'm interested in this big question of how does temperature affect dispersal, where dispersal is defined as movement between patches of habitat, and this is an important core ecological process that maintains genetic diversity and has stabilizing effects on populations that reduces the risk of extinction. So, as climate change causes temperatures to rise, species must either adapt to these new conditions or move in response to track their thermal niches. And this is dictated by dispersal. But temperatures affect both the ability and the motivation to disperse, which can lead to varying rates of dispersal throughout a landscape. And there's a bunch of different ways that temperature can influence dispersal, where temperature can have direct effects on dispersal. And in many habitats where temperatures are spatially homogeneous, dispersal cannot be used to evade high temperatures. And this is because if it's hot in one place, it's typically hot everywhere. Yet in some habitats, such as aquatic habitats, there's a lot more temperature variation between patches, even when air temperature is the same. So things like size, depth, and turbidity all affect the experienced temperature within an aquatic habitat. So in habitats with more temperature variation, there might be more motivation to disperse away from unsuitable environmental conditions. Temperature can also have indirect effects on dispersal through both interspecific and intraspecific interactions, but these effects can be really variable. So for example, if temperature increases predation, this might increase the motivation to disperse, but energy spent on avoidance behavior might impede dispersal ability. And these indirect effects are typically under-researched and are the focus of my research. And specifically, I'm focusing on intraspecific interactions. So high temperatures increase things like metabolism, which increases energy expenditure. And as a result, higher food requirements are needed to compensate for this. And those higher food requirements can increase the strength of competition for resources, and in some systems also increase rates of cannibalism. So the lack of resources or the risk of being eaten can prompt dispersal. So it's really important to understand the interactive effects of intraspecific interactions and temperature to predict dispersal responses. And my research focuses on backswimmers, specifically Nadanecta undulata, which are freshwater semi-aquatic insects that are common throughout North America. And in these freshwater habitats, they are super hungry generalist predators that eat pretty much anything that they can catch, and this includes other backswimmers. So they are opportunistic cannibals, and this is just a common behavior and not the result of scarcity. And even though their life cycles are aquatic, they can fly to disperse between patches of habitat, though this is energetically expensive. And we know a bit about how temperatures affect backswimmers, where high temperatures increase activity and consumption. But so far, we don't know how temperature affects dispersal in backswimmers. So this is a good study system to answer my question, and because of that semi-aquatic life history. So again, they're found in these freshwater habitats, but they can disperse between these patches by flying. So for example, smaller habitats might heat up more and faster throughout the day than larger habitats. So when dispersal occurs, the backswimmer can be exposed to really different temperature conditions that aren't necessarily related to dispersal distance. So there's a lot more unpredictability associated with habitat conditions after dispersing, which can result in a really little change or have a big benefit or consequence. So based on this system, I want to look at the indirect effects of temperature on dispersal through intraspecific interactions. So first, I want to look at how temperature affects dispersal directly and when accounting for interactions. And I predict that dispersal is going to increase with temperature because individuals will be motivated to disperse away from unsuitable temperatures when there's a lot of temperature variation in the landscape. So high risk with dispersal might also have high reward. I'm also interested in how temperature affects cannibalism rates. And I predict that temperature is going to increase metabolic rate and energy expenditure, resulting in hungrier backswimmers that use cannibalism to compensate for these energy requirements. And finally, I'm interested in whether intraspecific interactions such as cannibalism can explain temperature-related dispersal behaviors. And I predict that increased cannibalism is going to drive dispersal, and this is in agreement with my previous research that's shown that cannibalism risk can increase dispersal. And to answer my research questions, I conducted a field experiment at the University of Toronto's Koffler Scientific Reserve, located in King City, Ontario, Canada. And at the field station, I collected backswimmers from ponds on site and conducted an outdoor musicosm experiment with them. So in 15 experimental musicosms, I manipulated water temperature in a regression design ranging from about 24 to 34 degrees Celsius. And in each musicosm, I had backswimmers interacting in populations of 20 individuals. And so this results in 300 backswimmers total per block, and I conducted two consecutive blocks. And each backswimmer was labeled on their wing casing with a unique ID associated with their sex, body size, and temperature treatment. And backswimmers acclimated to these temperature treatments for about 7 days, with the mesocosms covered during this time to prevent dispersal from occurring. But I assessed mortality every day, and I replaced the dead individuals with unmarked backswimmers to keep the density constant. But I did not assess dispersal for these unmarked individuals. And then after this, the back swimmers underwent a dispersal period for another 7 days, where now the mesocosms are uncovered so the back swimmers can disperse by flying, and I assess mortality and dispersal every day during this time. And then I looked at how size, temperature, sex, and time affect dispersal and cannibalism using generalized linear mixed effects models with binomial error. And I found no effect of sex, so I removed this from all my models. And this is a great system because measuring both dispersal and mortality is easy. So each backswimmer is labeled with that unique ID number. So I know all the individuals that are supposed to be present in a mesocosm and can use process of elimination to see which individuals are missing, meaning that they've dispersed. And backswimmers eat by piercing their prey with their mouth parts, leaving a hollow exoskeleton intact. So I can still see dead backswimmers present in the mesocosm, and I can still read the ID numbers written on them. And I can determine if cannibalism is the cause of death using the squish test, where you pick up a dead backswimmer, give it a squish, and if it's hollow, that means that they were eaten. So I'm going to explore my first question, looking at how temperature affects dispersal rates. And when we look at temperature alone as the only predictor, this does not have a significant effect on dispersal probability. Yet there's a lot of variation in this, and I was interested in exploring beyond the direct effects of temperature on dispersal, accounting for size. So now, since I'm interested in temperature, size, and dispersal, I'm going to show my results in terms of a heat plot, where on my X, I have temperature, on my Y, I have body size increasing, and the dispersal probability is going to be the color, with a bright yellow being a high probability of dispersing, and a dark purple being a low probability of dispersing. And at lower temperatures, we see what we expect, where large backswimmers are most likely to disperse, likely just because they have the energy reserves to do so. Yet at high temperatures, this pattern completely flips, where now small backswimmers are most likely to disperse. So dispersal is determined by the interaction between size and temperature. So our first prediction wasn't supported, where temperature does not explain dispersal. Rather, there's this interaction that occurs between temperature and size, where we have size-specific dispersal occurring. So then I'm going to move on to look at my next question about how temperature affects cannibalism rates. And I'm going to show another heat plot with the same X and Y axes, but now the color is going to be showing cannibalism risk, with a bright yellow being a high risk of being eaten and a dark purple being a low risk of being eaten. And we saw that temperature increases rates of cannibalism, and this is size structured, where small individuals at high temperatures are most likely to be eaten. So our first prediction was supported, where high temperatures increase cannibalism, but with a size-specific nuance. And finally, I'm going to look at my third question, relating those cannibalism results to those dispersal results. So this is a really interesting result because we know that large backswimmers have more energy reserves, so are typically more able to disperse than small backswimmers. And we know that high temperatures increase energy expenditure further. So in theory, small backswimmers at high temperatures have the lowest energy reserves and therefore the lowest dispersal ability. Yet we're seeing an uptick in dispersal of small individuals at high temperatures. And it's likely that that high cannibalism risk at high temperatures is the driver of this. And this is in agreement with my previous research that cannibalism risk increases dispersal. So my prediction was supported, where individuals most at risk of being eaten are most likely to disperse. So temperature elicits a size-structured response that shapes dispersal through cannibalism dynamics. So both size and temperature influences cannibalism, and this whole relationship influences dispersal. So you might be thinking, so what, Nikki? Well, temperature influences dispersal indirectly through changes to intraspecific interactions, specifically changes in cannibalism. So high temperatures increase energy expenditure, so cannibalism rates generally increase. And this highlights that understanding these indirect pathways are important to really understand population level responses. We also saw that size matters, which can lead to size biased populations as climate change progresses. And at low temperatures, large back summers are most likely to disperse, likely because of that good body condition. And small back summers are most likely to stay because of low energy reserves. But at high temperatures, this flips, where now large back swimmers have that additional food source through cannibalism, which compensates for that sped up metabolic rate. And dispersal might not be easy for small back swimmers, but there's a strong motivation to disperse when they're at high risk of being eaten. So at high temperatures, large back swimmers dine and small back swimmers dash. And the big takeaway here is that climate change can restructure the size distributions of populations through changes in dispersal. And this is where we can expect strong impacts on trophic dynamics, where we have small individuals with lower reproductive rates, so small populations of small individuals that weaken top-down control and can make communities vulnerable to trophic cascades. And these results are applicable beyond back summers, also to other systems where we'd expect predation or cannibalism to be temperature dependent. And overall, we show that considering indirect effects of temperature on dispersal is really important in predicting species responses and predict persistence to climate change. And I'd like to thank you for listening.